Now, there are some additional challenges in producing biofuels. One, some biofuels that you might want to use, say gasoline replacements, can be toxic to the microbe. And that can be challenging because as the fuel starts to build up inside the vat where you're brewing these bugs, growing the bugs and getting them to produce this fuel, that fuel is going to intoxicate the producing microorganism. And that will be a real problem for getting high titers of the fuel that you're going to need to get a low cost. So we need to engineer those microbes to be able to be resistant to the fuel that you're producing. And that's still a challenge that we have. We have many ways of trying to solve that challenge. One would be to build a better chassis. So if you think about what's toxic about a biofuel and why is it toxic to the cell, a lot of these are toxic because they interfere with the membrane around the cell and interfere with the membrane functions. Well, what if we could put a better bag around the cell, something that would allow the cell to be resistant to those biofuels or more resistant, so that you could build up higher concentrations in the bioreactor and therefore produce higher titers and at lower cost. So these are some of the concepts that are really important. Now, some of the other biofuels that you might want to produce, like diesel and jet fuel, are soluble in the fermentation broth at a very low concentration. That is, not much will dissolve in. If you imagine mixing oil and water, they don't mix. You stir them up, you get an emulsion, and then that emulsion breaks, and the oil separates at the top, and the water is at the bottom. Now, the water phase, essentially, is where yeast or E. coli, the microbes that we've engineered, are growing. Now, can we get them to secrete those fuels from the cell so that they'll phase separate? And the answer is yes, we can do that. And this is really critical because it solves one of the most important problems of biofuels right now, and that is getting the biofuel pure. So if you brew beer and produce ethanol, that ethanol is produced maybe 6%, maybe 10% in the production facilities that produce ethanol for fuels. The yeast will produce maybe 20% if you're really lucky, but mainly 15%. That means that you've got 80 to 85% water, and you've got to extract that ethanol from the water, and it's completely miscible. That is, it completely mixes with that water, and that means that you've got to use a process to get that out, and that's an energy-intensive process. We use either membranes to separate it, or we might use distillation, where you boil it off, essentially. And that's a very energy-intensive and expensive process. So you're expending a lot of energy purifying that ethanol before you put it into your tank. But if you're producing an oil that just phase separates, you don't have to do that distillation. You skim it off the top. And if you're producing a biodiesel that's ready for the tank, you skim it off the top, do a quick purification, simple, low-cost purification, put it into the tank, and it's ready to go. That's the concept. The concept is in action. And that's really what Amyris is now doing and following up on the artemisinin project. If you recall, I mentioned that they couldn't make any money off the artemisinin project. They guaranteed, the University of California, when they licensed the technology, that they wouldn't take a profit off of that. And that's what's allowed us to make that drug at very low cost. But they had a chassis in hand that had been optimized for production of hydrocarbons. They could use that chassis for other products and make a profit from those. So that's how you build a company that does a non-profit thing and then does a for-profit thing that builds on that. And this is really exemplifies synthetic biology, because you're building modular components that can be assembled and reused in many different ways. We've built a chassis that was ideal for producing the hydrocarbon precursor to artemisinin. It can now produce the hydrocarbon precursor to biofuels.